been traveling far without a home, but not without a star. Free, only want to be free. We huddle close, but hang on to a dream. On the boats and on the planes, they come into America, never looking back again. They come into America. Don't it seem so far away? But we're traveling light today, in the eye of the storm, in the eye of the storm. Home to a new and a shining place. Make our bed and we'll say our grace. Freedom's like burning warm. Freedom's like burning warm. Everywhere around the world, they come into America. Every time that flag's unfurled, they come into America. Got a dream to take them there. They come into America. Got a dream they got to share. They come into America. They come into America. They come into America. They come into America. They come into America today. 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 My country 'tis thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing, of thee I sing today, 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 today.
Yes, folks, they're coming to America, and they're coming to chase a dream. But part of this dream was a reality, and that reality is reflected in the literature that is written at the time. And here was the reality. I keep coming back to this simple picture, but I think it means so much. Because if you look at this image of what a family should be, nobody matters. This woman doesn't matter, the children don't matter. The person in this picture who matters is the dad. Now, think about that for a minute. If you're a child in the family, you don't matter. You're going to be raised so that you can help make this life happen. You're going to be raised to grow the crops, milk the cows, do whatever. The wife's job is to have babies and to do those same chores. Now, the man doesn't have it that easy either, does he, guys? Because he's responsible for going out and making the living and bringing home food, and he is supposed to do all of that stuff while remaining godly. And in his heart of hearts, does he think, I'm going home to this person who chose me, who loves me, and who adores me. And I think that that's the basis of what people want in this world, whether they lived in 1650 or whether they're alive today. I believe that people want to have a place where they belong. And I think that, and let's take a minute and just look at one quick thing. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This simple pyramid will help you so much as you pursue your English studies, because an analysis of literature always comes down to the human, doesn't it? At the end of the day, it's all about the human experience. People, animals, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, people. And the hierarchy of needs begins at a very simple level. Breathing, food, water, recreating, sleep, homeostasis, and excretion. That's the basic physiological needs of all people, whether we're alive today, whether we were alive in 1650. Next is safety. Beyond the basic, we move into the security of body, of employment, of resources, of morality, of the family, of health, of property. And above that is love and belonging, friendship, family, and sexual intimacy. From there we have self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, respect by others. And at the top of the pyramid is the hierarchy of needs. Morality, creativity, spontaneity, problem solving, lack of prejudice, and acceptance of facts. Now this family system that is created by the Puritans, and in most degree by other faiths that are colonizing America, has a little tiny problem right here. Because this family unit is not one of courtship, where the man woos this 16-year-old girl and tells her wonderful things, makes promises. It is an arranged situation where the woman has a job. This is a new country. America's brand new. We need to have a population. These people managed to make it to America, and now they need to repopulate. But this love and belonging is such an essential part of the human experience. And so, in the literature that is written during this 50-year period between 1650 and 1700, it's interesting, if you're interested in this kind of thing, to look at the literature and see what's missing. We saw that in Little Anne Bradstreet's poem, "To My Loving Husband." And we see it in other pieces of literature from this particular period. Now remember that in this family system, people don't really matter. They're not sitting at the dinner table talking about what happened today, a shoe sale at Macy's. They're talking about not much at all. The children were to be silent. The wife certainly was to be silent. And this was a time to eat dinner and not much else. It's got to have been lonely, you all. Guys, it seems to me, and I could be wrong, but it seems to me that men, regardless of lifestyle, regardless of anything, just the way men are built and the way men's brains are constructed, and the soul of men, seems to me that there's a need to be desired by a partner, to be cherished by a partner, to be respected and cared for and cared about. Seems to me. Now, in this picture of how we're going to live our lives in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the other colonies that are being created, doesn't allow much for that, does it? Now, some of us have ancestors that date back to this particular era in history. And that brings us to, and we're going to get to those little girls pretty soon, but that gets us to this wonderful psychological concept of Carl Jung that is called the collective unconscious. Oh, when I was a teenager, that was the whole thing. People walked around with volumes of Carl Jung and talked about philosophy and the ideas, and it was wonderful. It was a wonderful time to be on a college campus. The collective unconscious indicates that the deepest unconscious mind is genetically inherited and is not shaped by personal experience. So that means that folks are operating in the world during whatever time they're alive, and part of their orientation to this earth has been inherited by ancestors who came from before. I know, it's wild, but it's fun to play with if you're interested in that kind of thing. If you're interested in why people do what they do. And it's interesting as we look forward to what these little girls inspired. But the collective unconscious always makes for interesting introspection, particularly in studies of literature. Now, before we leave our Carl, he also was spouting philosophy at the same time as Freud, and you've heard of Sigmund Freud. Freud believed that the unconscious was the product of personal experiences. Jung disagreed and believed that the unconscious is a product of collective experiences inherited in the genes, in the gene pool. Interesting, huh? All right. News travels fast. I don't know how, and I can't imagine how the news spread to the New World, but it did. It was common knowledge that at the same time, a little bit sooner than our particular era that we're getting ready to talk about in America, witch trials were going on in Spain. And those Spanish witch hunts were depicted as this. My goodness. Oh my goodness. What is going on? Well, in Spain, the Catholic Church sought heretics, remember that word that we learned earlier, for punishment, and in so doing, homogenizing religion in Europe. For both groups, the witch became a particularly high-profile flavor of heretic. But now, instead of the Catholics and the Puritans, or the Quakers and the Puritans, we have the Catholics and the Jews. And those who practiced Jewish faith had to convert to Catholicism, or here's what's going to happen. What in the world? Now, the church did hold trials for these people who would not conform to Catholicism, but anybody could testify against the accused, and they'd never learn who had accused them of the act in the first place. Now, if their family member wanted to testify on their behalf, that would mean that they would also likely be deemed a heretic. Remember that big word we learned in this first lecture series. And, of course, as I always say, let's follow the money. Because remember that if they do away with someone, who's going to get all their property? What happens to everything that they owned? Their home, their clothes, their goods, their everything. Yep, that's right. So the church in Spain conducted trials, and decided that they would be best to have the heretics burned at the stake, and to do that on a Sunday so that the citizens could attend after church. Do you see that nobody is thinking, what are we doing? Now they would march the accused down the street in some horrible, horrible state of affairs to their deaths. And thousands of them suffered this fate without anybody saying, wait just a minute, what are we doing? Well, as you might expect, they have to justify their actions, and so they cherry pick what they like out of the Bible, and that's what they use. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And those accused of witchcraft were most notably burned at the stake. The Bible had actually suggested stoning, another common practice. Do you all know what stoning is? The person is placed somewhere public, a public square, for instance, and people take their turns putting stones on top of that person. And all of these little people over here in the shadows not only know about it, but participate in it. And in Spain, it's believed that the church accused around 7,000 people of witchcraft, tried several thousand of them, and about a dozen died as a result. Some severely tortured while they were in the trial process. And that takes us to the little girls and Tituba, their exotic, wonderful nanny from Barbados, who would take the girls out into the woods and tell them all of her wonderful stories. And they absolutely loved it. Who were these little girls? Well, we had Elizabeth Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. And the problem was that these little girls heard all of these fabulous, wild stories. And like it would do anyone who led a very sheltered life, and your frame of reference for what the world is so limited. And now this wonderful, fabulous, exotic woman is telling you all these fantastic stories. And so, little Betty Paris had a nightmare. And when she woke up from this nightmare, her father, who just happened to be the town preacher, said, what in the world is going on? And little Betty told them all that she had seen in her dream. And they went ballistic. And they said, well, what is wrong with this child? Tituba must be a witch who has bewitched our darling girl, Betty. And then Abigail caught on, and she too said, oh, she had seen those same kinds of demons in her dreams. And now these little girls matter. People are paying attention to them. And because of how, I'm going to say it, uptight this community was, the entire community came unraveled because they so needed to believe something fantastic. And the little girls, the more their imagination was inspired, the more they mattered. What they said had an immediate effect and had an immediate payoff. The little girls start pointing out whoever they wanted to point the finger at and said, I saw that person, I saw a bat flying around that person. I saw that person with the book of witches, that all they had to do was point somebody out. And the whole town joined in, and hysteria swept the entirety of the colonies with these witch hunts that took place at the behest of these little girls who are getting more and more empowered and more dangerous every minute of every day. One of the judges who determined the fate of the people who these little girls pointed their little fingers at was Judge Hathorne, who was the great-great-grandfather of Nathaniel Hawthorne. Remember, we've already talked about him. He wrote the Scarlet Letter. He wrote a number of things, and the guilt he felt was palpable in the writings that he created. And it's interesting. I don't know who my great-great-grandfather was. I know who my great-grandfather was, but none of the relatives in my family have that kind of a history. And again, we go back to that collective unconscious, don't we? That belief or the philosophy that the sins of the father are passed on down to the children. That's the basis of that. So it's going to be interesting when we get to our Nathaniel to see the kinds of writings that he created from that sense of guilt for the deeds of his great-great-grandfather. If you're interested in those documents from the judges of those trials, this is a very interesting one. And this again is from History.com, which is one of my favorite references. And this is the actual manuscript. So if you're interested in this, you might want to come back and look this up. I've included the link here in the documents for these lectures. But it's very interesting. And this is just one. You can research and find many of the other documents. You can imagine the hysteria. Now we have something to talk about. There was a special courthouse constructed. You know, I was in Salem when they had their tricentennial celebration. And I went to Gallows Hill, and let me tell you something. It is spooky. Well, some of the people saw the writing on the wall, and they just confessed. I'm not going to fight this. I'm just going to confess. Tituba, the Barbados housekeeper, nanny, slave, immediately said, yes, I am, and was imprisoned. But now we get to the point where the little girls are pointing out people left and right. And Judge Hathorne, Samuel Sewell, and William Stoughton, the court handed down its first conviction against Bridget Bishop on June the 2nd. She was hanged 8 days later. Everybody went to the hanging. It's not something that happened in the dark of night while no one saw. Everybody went to Gallows Hill to see what was going on. By that July, 5 more people had been hanged, and in August, 8 more, and in September. In addition, 7 other accused witches died in jail, while the elderly Giles Corey, Martha's husband, was pressed to death by stones after he refused to enter a plea at his arraignment. Remember, we talked about stoning a minute ago. And when the little girls pointed out Rebecca Nurse, who was one of the nicest people in town, just a lovely woman, elderly lady, everybody loved her, but the little girls pointed her out, and so there she came before the judges. This is a depiction of Giles Corey being stoned in the town. And remember, all these people are watching. They're not hiding. they're participating. In all, 20 people were eventually executed as witches, but contrary to popular belief, none of the condemned was burned at the stake. That was saved for the witch trials in Spain. 19 of the victims of the Salem witch trials were instead taken to the infamous Gallows Hill to die by hanging. The elderly Giles Corey, meanwhile, was pressed to death with heavy stones after he refused to enter an innocent or guilty plea. Still more accused sorcerers died in jail while awaiting trial. So why did it end? People were obviously having their fill of excitement and watching people being hanged and Gallows Hill and all the thrill of the trials and public stonings. And why would it stop? What makes people stop doing this? Well, before we get to our Cotton Mather, who was the beginning of the end of the Salem witch trials, let's take a look at why and how these good, God-fearing people could have participated in this kind of hysterical histrionics. It's called mob mentality. Now remember, these folks had come from far. In order to find a new world, they're coming to America. And what they did was colonize in small groups. And the small groups were part of the larger group, the Puritan faith. And they had very strict rules about what people could and couldn't do, and just how much fun people could and couldn't have. And when the group seems to make some behaviors acceptable that would not be acceptable otherwise, the group goes along with it. The men who were in positions of leadership were making the rules, and because they didn't matter, the women and children went along with whatever laws they decided were to be in effect. Now, an interesting thing that you and I have seen in our lifetimes is the idea of anonymity, that people in a large group can experience a diffusion of responsibility if they hide behind their computer screens and mark their little likes or unlikes, or they spread little gossip things behind the safety of their computer screens. But in this particular instance, in Salem, nobody was hiding. They were packing a picnic lunch and heading out to Gallows Hill. They were going to the courthouse and joining right in with those girls. They were fueling the fire of all of this insanity. And that's what makes this period of history increasingly interesting for those people who find this to be of interest, and that is that these people were not hiding, and they were right there out front. Back to our magistrate, Cotton Mather. Now, people from other communities who were looking at the goings-on in Salem from the outside had begun to put a little pressure on the folks of Salem. Not everybody joined with the Salem folks in thinking that this was going on. Some joined right in. Some formed courts and they came up with hysterical trials themselves. None to the liking of Salem, but Salem was starting to get a little bit of a bad reputation. And so, Cotton Mather, so part of the beginning of the end, was the one voice of reason, Cotton Mather, who had watched all these trials, but he had warned that spectral evidence, which were these girls pointing to anybody that they thought would be fun and saying that they saw them standing in the river next to a ghost or next to a witch, that was not really evidence. And the testimony about dreams and visions wasn't really evidence. His concerns went largely unheeded during the Salem witch trials. But he was the president of Harvard College, and Cotton's father also later joined his son in urging that the standards of evidence for witchcraft must be equal to those for any other crime, and they finally concluded that it would be better that 10 suspected witches may escape than one innocent person be condemned. And the result of that, and other folks beginning to whisper about the possible sanity of Salem folks, caused the waning of public support for the trial. And that really is the core of the truth of it, isn't it? People get tired. People get bored. Pretty soon the hysteria settled, and people needed something else to see. The 15 minutes of fame for little Betty and Abigail were wearing thin, and people began to get bored. And that's how these things come to an end, really. Somebody stands up and says, this isn't right. What's going on here isn't right. You can't tell me that this is good policy, that this is the right behavior. You can't tell me that. This is out of control. This is out of hand. Other people began to whisper, maybe these guys aren't wrapped all that tight. And so people stopped being interested in it. And so in January of 1697, in the cold of winter, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting for the tragedy of the Salem witch trials. Samuel Sewall publicly apologized for his role in the process. He had sentenced several of them to death. The damage to the community lingered even after the Massachusetts colony passed legislation restoring the good names of the condemned, even though they had been hanged, and providing some financial restitution to their heirs and family members in 1711. The vivid and painful legacy of the Salem witch trials endured well into the 20th century. That's when Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, which folks generally study along with The Scarlet Letter. And in 1950, the whole Salem witch trial model started all over again with Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. If you're interested in that, look into it. It's very interesting. And once again, Joseph McCarthy stirred up rumors, innuendo, and a black list of names of people who might be communists, and witch trials took place everywhere. The only difference is those folks weren't hanged, but it was history repeating itself. So that concludes our little tour of one of the most infamous chapters in American history. There are some activities below this for you to submit. All of them I think will be interesting in light of all that you've learned about this 50 years of nuts. And I think it will be interesting as we move forward into a new generation of the 1700s. Remember to click on the activities below these lecture tutorials and enjoy the exercises that accompany this tour of 1650 to 1699.
Pero ahora se graba o no se graba?
No, todavía no.
Ah.
Nils no va a decir nada y me voy aquí.
Mira.
Si puedes venir más cerca también.
Vale. ¿Por qué pienso que me importo? Pues...
Natuurlijk fontos.
Dat is een hele moeilijke vraag.
Un momento conmigo.
Ya, vale, que voy a escuchar también.
Non trova da učito, da ne?
Imaš ima di koša pidi.
Porque soy un pequeño saltamontes que defiende.
Чакам приятелката си на летището и слушам всички ти истории. Или поне се представям.
Mert én vagyok a legszórakoztatóbb és legbölcsebb pessimista a világon.
Onze wereld stortte even in, maar ik was daar voor ons allemaal en vooral voor mijn zusje.
Som dôležitá tak veľmi, že môj brat si dal moje meno vytetovať na telo. Neskôr som urobila to isté z jeho mena.
Bebeğin tümörü için 3 kere ameliyat olup onu galibiyetiyle halen hayatta gülerek devam etmekteyim. Evet.
Mert igaz barát vagyok.
Sono veramente fatami ha detto, trasformando in cineasta.
И някога Микел преди писано
Добре, това ти ли си го съчинила?
Малко да.
Прекрасно е.
Todavía te ríes.
Y eso es de verdad, ¿eh?